Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy corridors of medieval castles where every meal could be your last, and every bite carried the weight of kingdoms. You can almost hear the clinking of silver against porcelain, the whispered prayers of nervous servants, and the steady breathing of a man whose sole purpose is to die for his king's dinner. The air is thick with the aroma of roasted meats and the metallic scent of fear. As you witness a world where dining wasn't just about sustenance, it was about survival, politics, and the delicate dance between life and death that played out 3 times a day. Picture yourself in the year 1347, standing in the great hall of a French chateau, watching as a trembling young man approaches a golden chalice filled with wine. His hands shake not from the cold stone floors beneath his feet, but from the knowledge that this single sip might be his final act on earth. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why royal meals took hours to serve, or why kings often seemed so paranoid about the simplest pleasures. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to let me know where and when you started watching this video, or perhaps share what fascinates you most about the strange world of royal dining customs. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported to the opulent dining chambers where the most bizarre and deadly serious food rule of all time governed every royal meal: the mandatory poison prevention protocol. This wasn't simply a matter of having someone taste your food, it was an elaborate, choreographed dance of death that could involve dozens of people, multiple testing phases, and rituals so complex they resembled religious ceremonies. The position of royal food taster, or praegustator as they were formerly known, wasn't filled by volunteers. You watch as these individuals, often chosen from lower nobility or trusted servants, understand that their life expectancy has just shortened considerably. They weren't just tasting for poison, they were human canaries in the coal mine of medieval political intrigue. Every morning, they would wake knowing that breakfast, lunch, or dinner could deliver their final breath. The process begins long before the king enters his dining chamber. You observe the kitchen staff, working under the watchful eyes of multiple supervisors, as they prepare each dish according to strict protocols. Every ingredient has been sourced from trusted suppliers, stored in locked chambers, and handled only by Bedtime servants who have undergone background investigations that would make modern security clearances seem casual. The head cook himself often comes from a family that has served the royal household for generations. Their loyalty purchased not just with gold, but with the lives of their ancestors. But here's where the protocol becomes truly bizarre. The tasting doesn't happen just once. You witness a multi-stage testing process that transforms a simple meal into an hours-long ordeal. First, the praegustator must consume a substantial portion of each dish, not just a delicate nibble, but enough that any slow-acting poison would take effect. Then comes the waiting period, sometimes lasting up to an hour, during which the taster sits in a designated chamber while physicians monitor their pulse, breathing, and complexion for any signs of distress. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this practice lies in the very real threat posed by political assassination through poisoning. Historical records show that Emperor Claudius, several Byzantine emperors, and countless medieval nobles met their end through contaminated food and drink. The fear wasn't paranoid fantasy, it were pulled, calculated reality based on centuries of precedent. During this waiting period, you notice something peculiarly touching about the relationship between the royals and their tasters. Despite the inherent disposability of the position, many kings developed genuine affection for these brave souls who literally put their lives on the line daily. King Louis IX of France was known to personally tend to tasters who fell ill, even from natural causes, and some tasters were granted significant wealth and titles after surviving particularly dangerous periods in their careers. The quirky tidbit that historians love to whisper about involves the development of taster's insurance, a medieval concept where wealthy families would maintain multiple food tasters simultaneously, rotating them to reduce individual risk and ensure continuity of service. Some particularly paranoid nobles employed tasters for their tasters, creating a pyramid of protection that could involve a dozen people testing a single meal. But the protocol extended beyond just consuming the food. You watch as tasters must also handle the plates, cups, and utensils, as certain poisons could be applied to surfaces rather than mixed into the food itself. They would run their fingers along the rim of goblets, press their palms against serving platters, and even breathe deeply over steaming dishes to detect any unusual vapours that might indicate the presence of toxic substances. The psychological toll on these individuals was immense. You can see it in their faces, the constant vigilance, the way they pause before each bite, the silent prayers they whisper before lifting a spoon to their lips. Many developed what we might now recognise as severe anxiety disorders. Their nerves frayed by the daily confrontation with mortality. Some kept detailed journals, not of court gossip or political observations, but of every meal they survived, creating morbid calendars that marked their continued existence. Historians still argue whether the elaborate nature of these protocols was actually effective against determined assassins, or if they served more as psychological theatre designed to demonstrate the monarch's importance and the lengths to which their protection extended. The very visibility of the process sent a clear message to potential conspirators. The king was so valuable, so protected, that even his food required a human sacrifice before consumption. The tools of the trade became increasingly sophisticated over time. You observe special silver utensils that were believed to change colour in the presence of certain poisons, though modern science has shown these beliefs to be largely mythical. Some courts employed exotic animals, small birds or mice, as additional testing subjects, creating miniature menageries whose sole purpose was to die for royal safety. The seasonal variations in this protocol add another layer of complexity to your observations. During times of political tension, war, or succession disputes, the testing process could double or triple in duration. You witness periods where meals grew cold waiting for the extended observation periods, where royal hunger had to yield to royal survival, and where the simple act of eating became a statement of defiance against those who would do harm. As you absorb the weight of this daily ritual, you begin to understand that dining, for medieval royalty, was never about pleasure or sustenance alone. It was a public demonstration of power, vulnerability, loyalty, and the precious nature of royal life. Every meal was a small victory against the forces of political chaos, and every surviving taster was a living testament to the price of keeping kings alive in a world where poison was the weapon of choice for those who couldn't wield swords. You step deeper into the intricate world of medieval royal dining, where the very utensils in your hand could determine whether you lived as a respected courtier or died as a social outcast. The gleaming surfaces of spoons, knives, and eventually forks weren't just tools for eating, they were symbols of power, markers of hierarchy and weapons in the endless battle for social supremacy that played out across every royal table in Europe. Picture yourself examining a magnificent silver spoon, its handle carved with intricate designs depicting family crests and religious symbols. This isn't simply cutlery, it's a proclamation of worth, a tangible representation of your place in the rigid social structure that governed medieval life. The weight in your palm tells a story of privilege, while the engraved details whisper secrets about bloodlines, political alliances, and the delicate negotiations that determined who could sit where and eat with what. The Great Spoon hierarchy system emerged from the practical reality that medieval nobles needed visible ways to display their status. You discover that in many courts, the size, material, and decorative complexity of your eating utensils directly corresponded to your rank in the social order. A duke might dine with a golden spoon adorned with precious gems, while a minor baron would be granted silver, and lesser nobility might find themselves wielding pewter or even carved wood. But the system extended far beyond simple material value. You observe the intricate protocols governing spoon presentation and usage. The highest-ranking nobles would have their personal utensils carried by dedicated servants who would polish them to mirror brightness before each meal. These weren't communal implements to be shared, they were personal treasures that accompanied their owners to every dining occasion, carefully stored in velvet-lined cases between uses. The mainstream historical fact underlying this practice stems from the genuine scarcity and value of metal utensils during medieval times. Archaeological evidence shows that even wealthy households might own only a few metal spoons, making them valuable enough to be mentioned specifically in wills and inheritance documents. Kings would sometimes grant ceremonial spoons as rewards for service, and these gifts could elevate entire families in social standing. You witnessed the careful choreography that surrounded spoon etiquette during formal meals. The order in which utensils were presented followed strict hierarchical rules. The king's spoon would be placed first, followed by immediate family members, then high-ranking nobles in descending order of importance. Servants would literally count steps and measure distances to ensure that each person's utensil placement reflected their exact position in court hierarchies. The psychological impact of this system becomes apparent as you watch courtiers obsess over the smallest details. A spoon placed slightly too far from one's plate could be interpreted as an insult. A utensil that was less ornate than expected might signal a fall from royal favour. You see nobles spending fortunes on increasingly elaborate eating implements, creating an arms race of ostentation that could bankrupt families desperate to maintain appearances. The training protocols for spoon mastery were exhaustingly comprehensive. You observe young nobles spending hours learning not just the proper grip and angle for different spoon types, but the subtle art of spoon semiotics, how to read meaning into every gesture, placement, and presentation. They practiced the ceremonial lifting techniques that showed respect for their betters, while asserting dominance over their inferiors, creating a complex language of utensil manipulation that took years to master. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this system even more bizarre involves the practice of spoon inheritance ceremonies. When a high-ranking noble died, their personal eating utensils wouldn't simply pass to their heirs. They would be formally presented in elaborate court ceremonies that resembled coronations. The new owner would have to demonstrate their worthiness to inherit such prestigious implements, sometimes through displays of loyalty, acts of service, or even combat demonstrations. The geographical variations in spoon hierarchy reveal fascinating cultural differences across medieval Europe. You discover that English courts favoured spoons with religious imagery, considering elaborate biblical scenes carved into handles as signs of divine favour. French nobility preferred abstract artistic designs that showcased the skill of master craftsmen, while Germanic courts valued spoons that incorporated family heraldry and military symbols reflecting their warrior traditions. The development of specialized spoon categories created even more complex social distinctions. You encounter soup spoons, sauce spoons, dessert spoons, ceremonial spoons, blessing spoons reserved for religious occasions, and even mourning spoons with deliberately somber designs. Each category had its own protocols and status implications, with master spoon stewards employed to ensure the correct implements were used for each course and occasion. Historians still argue whether the spoon hierarchy system was primarily about displaying wealth, or if it served more practical purposes related to food safety and hygiene. Some scholars suggest that personal utensils reduced the spread of disease, while others maintain that the system was purely about social control and visual demonstration of power structures. The training required to navigate spoon etiquette was extensive and began in childhood for noble families. You observe young aristocrats practicing with wooden replicas, learning not just how to hold and use different types of spoons, but how to read the subtle signals embedded in their presentation. A slightly tarnished spoon might indicate economic troubles, while an overly ornate one could suggest nouveau riche desperation for acceptance. The seasonal protocols added another layer of complexity to the spoon hierarchy. During religious holidays, certain types of decorative spoons were required, while periods of mourning demanded simpler, less ornate implements. You watch as court officials maintain detailed records of which spoons should be used during which occasions, creating bureaucratic departments dedicated entirely to utensil management. The international diplomatic implications of spoon protocol become evident when you witness foreign dignitaries visiting royal courts. The choice of which spoons to provide visiting nobles could send political messages, indicate the level of respect being shown, or even communicate subtle threats. Providing spoons that were too simple could be seen as an insult, while overly elaborate ones might suggest the host was trying too hard to impress. The economic impact of the spoon hierarchy system was substantial. You discover that entire industries developed around creating, maintaining, and trading elaborate eating utensils. Master craftsmen specialized in royal cutlery, forming guilds with their own rules and apprenticeship programs. The value of these implements was so significant that they were often used as collateral for loans or traded like currency in diplomatic negotiations. The maintenance requirements for these precious utensils created another class of specialized servants. You observe spoon polishers, spoon guards, and spoon historians who maintain detailed records of each implement's provenance and significance. These servants knew the complete genealogy of every spoon in the royal collection, understanding which had been used for coronation feasts, diplomatic banquets, or religious ceremonies. The decline of the spoon hierarchy system came gradually, as you observe changing social structures and the eventual democratization of metal utensils making them more widely available. But during its height, this bizarre system of edible hierarchies shaped social interactions, determined political alliances, and created a world where the simple act of lifting soup to your lips became a complex navigation of status, respect, and social survival. As you contemplate the weight of protocol that surrounded something as basic as eating utensils, you begin to understand how every aspect of royal dining was transformed into an opportunity for social positioning, political maneuvering, and the endless dance of medieval court life where even spoons could kill careers and cutlery could crown kings. You find yourself confronting one of the most shocking and bewildering aspects of royal dining etiquette that modern minds can barely comprehend: the bizarre tradition of conducting elaborate meals while monarchs attended to their most private bodily functions. The ornate chamber pot, decorated with gold leaf and precious stones, sits prominently in what appears to be a dining room, while servants arrange elaborate place settings around this most intimate of royal necessities. The scene before you defies every notion of propriety and hygiene that civilization has spent centuries developing. You watch as King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, receives visiting dignitaries while seated upon his close stool, a padded, upholstered toilet chair that doubles as a throne of power. The contradiction is stunning. Here sits the most powerful monarch in Europe, conducting affairs of state and enjoying multi-course meals while simultaneously relieving himself, all while maintaining the rigid protocols of court etiquette. This wasn't some aberrant behaviour confined to a single eccentric ruler. You discover that bathroom dining became an institutionalised practice across multiple European courts, with elaborate protocols governing who could be present, what could be discussed, and how meals should be served during these most private moments. The morning levee, as it was formerly known, transformed the royal toilet into a dining room, conference chamber, and social hub all simultaneously. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this bizarre practice lies in the medieval and early modern understanding of royal accessibility and divine authority. Kings were believed to rule by divine right, making every moment of their existence, including their most private functions, inherently sacred and politically significant. Denying access to the monarch during any activity, even the most intimate, was considered tantamount to rejecting royal authority itself. You observe the careful choreography that surrounded these bathroom dining sessions. Specialised servants, known as grooms of the stool, would prepare elaborate place settings on portable tables that could be positioned around the royal toilet chair. The finest china, crystal goblets, and silver cutlery would be arranged with the same precision used for state banquets, creating a surreal juxtaposition between elegant dining and bodily functions. The guest list for these bathroom dining experiences was carefully curated and highly coveted. You witness noble competing Fischerstiller for invitators to join the king during his morning constitutional, understanding that such intimate access represented the pinnacle of court favour. Being invited to share breakfast while the monarch relieved himself was considered a greater honour than attending formal state dinners, as it demonstrated a level of trust and intimacy reserved for only the most privileged courtiers. The conversational protocols during these sessions were particularly complex. You noticed that certain topics were considered appropriate for bathroom dining, personal gossip, family matters, and informal political discussions, while others remained taboo. Military strategy, formal diplomatic negotiations, and religious ceremonies were generally reserved for more traditional settings, though exceptions existed for urgent matters that couldn't wait for the monarch's completion of his toilet. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this practice even more extraordinary involves the development of specialised bathroom dining furniture. Master craftsmen created elaborate close stools that functioned as both toilets and dining chairs, with built-in armrests designed to hold plates, cup holders carved into the sides, and even small drawers for storing napkins and eating utensils. Some of these pieces were works of art in their own right, decorated with inlays, carvings, and upholstered with the finest fabrics available. The international diplomatic implications of bathroom dining created unique challenges for foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries. You watch as elaborate protocols developed for how non-French courtiers should behave when invited to join Louis XIV during his morning toilet. Some foreign nobles found the practice so shocking that they declined invitations, potentially damaging important diplomatic relationships. Others embraced it as an opportunity to gain unprecedented access to royal decision-making processes. The servants responsible for facilitating bathroom dining developed highly specialized skills and protocols. You observe them learning to serve multi-course meals while navigating the confined space around the royal toilet chair, maintaining perfect etiquette while dealing with the odours and sounds that naturally accompanied such sessions. These servants were often sworn to absolute secrecy about conversations they overheard, making them valuable sources of intelligence for various court factions. The menu planning for bathroom dining required careful consideration of foods that could be eaten elegantly while seated on a toilet chair. You discover that certain dishes were specifically developed for these occasions, finger foods that didn't require complex utensil manipulation, beverages that could be consumed without elaborate ceremony, and desserts that wouldn't create embarrassing sounds or smells that might interfere with the primary activity taking place. Historians still argue whether bathroom dining represented the ultimate expression of royal power, the ability to transform even the most private and undignified human activities into state occasions, or whether it demonstrated the bizarre extremes to which court culture could evolve when unchecked by practical considerations. Some scholars suggest it was a deliberate power play, forcing courtiers to literally worship the king even during his most vulnerable moments. The medical implications of combining dining with defecation created interesting challenges for royal physicians. You witness doctors struggling to advise monarchs about digestive health while navigating the political reality that questioning bathroom dining practices could be interpreted as challenging royal prerogatives. Some physicians developed elaborate theories about how certain foods consumed during toilet sessions could aid in digestion and elimination, creating a pseudo-scientific justification for the practice. The architectural requirements for facilitating bathroom dining led to the development of specialized palace chambers. You observe rooms designed specifically for royal toilet dining, with proper ventilation systems, elegant decor to mask the utilitarian function, and spatial arrangements that allowed for both privacy and the accommodation of multiple guests and servants. These chambers were often among the most luxuriously appointed rooms in royal residences. The psychological impact on participants in bathroom dining sessions was profound and varied. You watch as some courtiers develop strategies for breathing through their mouths, focusing intensely on conversation to distract from the environment, and maintaining perfect composure despite the unusual circumstances. Others seem to genuinely embrace the practice as a unique form of intimacy with royal power, finding excitement in the transgressive nature of the experience. The decline of bathroom dining came gradually as changing social attitudes about privacy, hygiene, and appropriate behaviour slowly influenced even the most tradition-bound royal courts. You observe the practice evolving from mandatory attendance to optional participation to eventual abandonment, though it persisted in some European courts well into the 18th century. The gender dynamics of bathroom dining created additional complications, as female royalty faced different expectations and challenges when attempting to maintain dignity while conducting business during intimate moments. You discover that queens and female rulers often developed alternative approaches to maintaining accessibility while preserving modesty, creating parallel traditions that were less documented but equally complex. As you absorb the full implications of this extraordinary dining tradition, you begin to understand how royal culture could transform literally any human activity into an opportunity for political maneuvering, social positioning, and the demonstration of absolute power. The ability to make defecation into a diplomatic occasion represented perhaps the ultimate expression of royal authority over both nature and society. You enter a world where a single grain of white crystal could spark international incidents, topple governments, and transform a simple meal into a life or death ceremony that would make modern security protocols seem casual by comparison. The sacred substance known as salt, that humble mineral we now sprinkle carelessly on French fries, commanded reverence, terror, and elaborate ritual protocols that governed every royal dining experience across medieval Europe. The gleaming salt cellar before you isn't merely a serving vessel, it's a throne for one of the most powerful substances known to medieval civilization. Crafted from precious metals and adorned with jewels, this ornate container holds what was literally worth its weight in gold and sometimes more. You watch as servants approach it with the reverence typically reserved for religious relics, their movements careful and deliberate, understanding that the slightest mishap could result in everything from personal disaster to diplomatic catastrophe. The positioning of the salt cellar on royal tables followed protocols so complex they required dedicated court officials to oversee their implementation. You observe the salt master, a position of tremendous importance and responsibility, as he calculates the precise placement that will reflect the intricate social hierarchies present at each meal. The distance between your seat and the salt cellar wasn't just about convenience, it was a public declaration of your worth, your relationship to the crown, and your standing in the delicate ecosystem of royal favour. The mainstream historical fact underlying salt's sacred status stems from its genuine scarcity and necessity in medieval life. Before refrigeration, salt was the primary method of food preservation, making it literally essential for survival. Control of salt sources, from coastal evaporation ponds to underground mines, represented control over life itself. Kings who controlled salt trade routes wielded power that extended far beyond their territorial boundaries, creating economic empires built on tiny white crystals. The phrase "sitting above the salt" emerged from the practice of placing the most honoured guests physically closer to the salt cellar than those of lesser importance. You witness the careful choreography as servants measure exact distances, ensuring that each placement sends the correct social signal. A guest seated too far from the salt might interpret their position as an insult, while someone placed inappropriately close could be seen as overreaching their station, either situation capable of destroying careers or starting conflicts. But the true terror of salt protocol centered around the catastrophic implications of spilling it. You watch as a young page accidentally knocks over a small dish of salt, and the immediate reaction is nothing short of apocalyptic. Servants freeze in horror, conversations halt mid-sentence, and the unlucky page's face drains of colour as he realises he has just committed what amounts to a cardinal sin in the presence of royalty. The superstitions surrounding spilled salt weren't merely quaint folk beliefs. They were deeply embedded in the political and religious consciousness of medieval society. You discover that salt spills were interpreted as omens of death, betrayal, or divine displeasure, with the specific patterns of scattered grains analysed like tea leaves to predict future disasters. When salt was spilled in the presence of royalty, it was considered a direct threat to the monarch's life and reigns. The quirky historical tidbit that makes salt protocol even more bizarre involves the elaborate purification ceremonies required after accidental spills. You witness servants performing complex rituals involving throwing additional salt over shoulders, reciting specific prayers, and sometimes requiring the presence of court chaplains to perform blessing ceremonies. These weren't quick fixes, they could extend meals by hours while proper spiritual cleansing took place. The economic implications of salt ceremony were staggering. You observe royal households maintaining salt reserves that represented small fortunes, stored in locked chambers with security that rivaled royal treasuries. The salt used for ceremonial purposes was often specially sourced from specific locations believed to possess particular spiritual or medicinal properties, with some types commanding prices that exceeded precious metals. The seasonal variations in salt ceremony reflected the agricultural calendar and religious observances. During Lent, for example, salt protocols became even more elaborate as the substance took on additional spiritual significance related to purification and penance. You watch as different types of salt, sea salt, rock salt, blessed salt, were employed for different occasions, each requiring its own handling protocols and symbolic interpretations. The international diplomatic aspects of salt ceremony created unique challenges for foreign visitors to royal courts. You witness ambassadors receiving detailed briefings on proper salt etiquette before attending state dinners, understanding that ignorance of these protocols could be interpreted as deliberate insults to their hosts. Some diplomatic incidents were triggered by misunderstandings about salt placement, sharing, or handling procedures. Historians still argue whether the elaborate nature of salt ceremonies reflected genuine religious beliefs about the substance's spiritual properties, or whether they evolved as methods of social control and status display. The intersection of practical necessity, religious symbolism, and political power created a perfect storm of significance that elevated simple sodium chloride to near-divine status. The medical theories surrounding salt added another layer of complexity to its ceremonial importance. You discover that medieval physicians believed different types of salt possessed various healing properties, with royal courts employing specialized salt doctors who could prescribe specific varieties for different ailments. The salt used in royal dining wasn't just for flavor. It was considered essential medicine that required proper ceremonial handling to maintain its therapeutic power. The training required for servants who handled salt in royal presence was extensive and rigorous. You observe young palace workers spending months learning proper salt ceremony, practicing the precise movements, memorizing the prayers and incantations, and developing the steady hands necessary to avoid catastrophic spills. These servants often came from families with generational experience in salt handling, passing down secrets and techniques through bloodlines. The architectural considerations for proper salt ceremony influenced palace design and dining room layouts. You notice specially designed alcoves for salt storage, drainage systems to handle spills, and ventilation arrangements that protected the precious substance from humidity and contamination. Some royal dining chambers were built around the requirements of salt ceremony, with entire rooms designed to facilitate proper handling and display of this critical substance. The psychological impact of salt ceremony on royal dining participants was profound. You watch courtiers develop nervous habits around salt handling, some becoming so anxious about potential spills that they would avoid reaching for anything near the salt cellar. Others became obsessed with salt placement as a method of reading royal favour, interpreting minute changes in positioning as signals about their standing at court. The decline of elaborate salt ceremony coincided with improvements in food preservation technology and the democratization of salt access through improved mining and trade techniques. You observe the gradual relaxation of protocols as salt became more readily available, though vestiges of these traditions persisted in royal courts for centuries after their practical necessity had passed. The religious dimensions of salt ceremony connected to broader medieval beliefs about the spiritual properties of natural substances. You discover that salt was believed to possess protective qualities against evil spirits, making its proper handling essential for royal safety. The blessing of salt became a formal religious ceremony in many courts, with chaplains performing elaborate consecration rituals over the royal salt supply. As you contemplate the weight of ceremony that surrounded something as basic as seasoning food, you begin to understand how medieval royal culture could transform any substance, no matter how common, into a symbol of power, status, and divine authority through the application of elaborate ritual and the human tendency to find meaning in the most practical necessities of daily life. You find yourself witnessing one of the most contentious and theologically explosive dining controversies in medieval history, a battle over a simple two-pronged utensil that would rage for centuries and divide the Christian world more dramatically than many religious schisms. The fork, that innocent-looking tool we now use without thought, represents a fascinating clash between practicality and piety, innovation and tradition, that transformed royal dining tables into battlegrounds of moral conviction. The scene before you unfolds in an 11th century Byzantine court, where you observe Princess Theodora Dukaina wielding what appears to be a miniature pitchfork, a golden, two-pronged implement that allows her to lift food to her mouth without touching it with her fingers. The gasps of horror from visiting Western European nobles aren't about poor etiquette. They're witnessing what they believe to be a tool of the devil himself, an affront to God's design for human hands and a corruption of natural eating practices ordained by divine will. The fork's journey into royal dining represents one of history's most peculiar technological adoption struggles. You watch as this Byzantine innovation slowly creeps westward, carried by marriages, diplomatic exchanges, and curious travellers who dare to experiment with what many consider satanic cutlery. The resistance isn't merely cultural, it's deeply theological, rooted in beliefs that God created human hands specifically for the purpose of handling food, and that using artificial extensions represents a rejection of divine design. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this controversy lies in the genuine religious opposition that greeted early fork adoption. Church leaders, including influential bishops and theologians, preached sermons condemning forks as tools of vanity and spiritual corruption. They argued that if God had intended humans to eat with metal prongs, he would have equipped them with such appendages naturally. The fork represented human arrogance in attempting to improve upon divine creation. You observe the dramatic moment when Theodora Dukaina arrives in Venice in 1071 to marry Doge Domenico Selvo, bringing with her not just Byzantine customs but also her collection of golden forks. The Venetian court's reaction is immediate and visceral. Many courtiers refuse to attend meals where forks are present, considering them instruments of spiritual contamination that could corrupt their souls through mere proximity. When Theodora dies of plague shortly after her arrival, many interpret her death as divine punishment for her fork usage. The slow acceptance of forks in royal courts created fascinating social divisions. You witness the emergence of fork courts and anti-fork courts, with monarchs taking the explicit positions on the theological implications of pronged eating utensils. Some rulers embraced forks as symbols of sophistication and cultural advancement, while others banned them entirely as threats to Christian virtue and traditional values. The practical advantages of fork usage gradually began to overcome religious objections, particularly as royal cuisine became more elaborate and refined. You watch as complex dishes requiring delicate handling made finger eating increasingly impractical and messy. Sauces, hot foods, and intricate presentations all argued for the utility of forks, creating tension between practical necessity and spiritual conviction that played out in royal dining rooms across Europe. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this controversy even more fascinating involves the development of compromise cutlery. experimental utensils designed to provide fork-like functionality while avoiding the theological implications of traditional prongs. You observe ingenious solutions like spoons with pointed ends, knives with small prongs, and even specialized tongs that allowed food manipulation without technically using forks. These hybrid implements often failed practically, but demonstrated the lengths to which people would go to avoid spiritual contamination. The gender dynamics of fork adoption added another layer of complexity to the controversy. You discover that women were often the first to embrace fork usage, partly because their elaborate clothing made finger-eating more challenging, but also because forks allowed them to maintain the delicate, refined appearance expected of noble ladies. This gendered association with forks sometimes increased male resistance, as men viewed fork usage as effeminate or unmanly. The international diplomatic implications of fork protocol created unique challenges for royal courts. You witness elaborate negotiations about whether foreign dignitaries would be provided with forks during state dinners, with some rulers refusing to accommodate fork users while others insisted that modern dining required pronged utensils. These disagreements could affect trade relationships, marriage negotiations, and military alliances. Historians still argue whether the fork controversy reflected genuine religious conviction or served as a convenient excuse for cultural conservatism and resistance to foreign influence. The Byzantine origins of forks made them suspect in Western European courts already suspicious of Eastern Orthodox practices and innovations, creating a perfect storm of theological and political opposition. The educational requirements for proper fork usage created new categories of court instruction. You observe specialized tutors teaching the complex etiquette of fork handling, how to hold them, which foods required forks versus fingers, and the subtle social signals communicated through fork usage. These lessons often included theological discussions about the moral implications of various eating methods, blending practical instruction with spiritual guidance. The economic impact of fork adoption was substantial, as you discover entire industries developing around the production of specialized eating utensils. Master metalworkers began creating increasingly elaborate fork designs, competing for royal commissions and developing new techniques for crafting prongs that were both functional and decorative. The value of ornate forks sometimes exceeded that of other royal jewellery, making them targets for theft and objects of inheritance disputes. The medical theories surrounding fork usage added scientific arguments to the theological debate. You witness court physicians arguing that forks prevented the transmission of diseases through hand-to-mouth contact, while others maintained that natural finger-eating promoted better digestion and healthier relationships with food. These medical opinions often aligned conveniently with existing religious or cultural positions on fork usage. The seasonal and ceremonial variations in fork protocol created additional complexity for royal dining arrangements. You observe certain religious holidays when fork usage was explicitly banned, periods of penance when natural eating was required, and feast days when elaborate fork ceremonies demonstrated royal sophistication. The religious calendar became intertwined with cutlery choices in ways that would seem absurd to modern diners. The psychological impact of the fork controversy on royal dining participants was profound. You watch courtiers agonizing over whether to use forks when provided, understanding that their choice could be interpreted as statements about their religious conviction, cultural sophistication, or political allegiances. Some developed elaborate mental frameworks for justifying fork usage to themselves, while others proudly maintained finger-eating practices as demonstrations of spiritual purity. The architectural implications of fork adoption influenced royal dining room design and table arrangements. You notice changes in place-setting layouts, the development of specialized fork storage and cleaning facilities, and modifications to serving procedures that accommodated pronged utensil usage. Palace kitchens had to adapt their cooking methods to produce food suitable for fork handling, fundamentally altering royal cuisine preparation. The artistic and decorative possibilities of fork design eventually helped overcome religious objections as craftsmen created implements so beautiful they became objects of aesthetic appreciation rather than mere tools. You observe forks decorated with religious imagery, blessed by chaplains, and incorporated into ceremonial presentations that transform them from suspect foreign innovations into expressions of royal magnificence and divine favour. As you contemplate this centuries-long battle over something as simple as eating utensils, you begin to understand how technological innovation, even in its most basic forms, could challenge fundamental beliefs about divine will, human nature, and proper social order in ways that transformed royal dining from mere sustenance into theological battlegrounds where souls and civilizations hung in the balance. You find yourself transported into a dining hall where the very act of chewing has been transformed into a symphonic performance, where every bite must harmonize with carefully orchestrated musical arrangements, and where the failure to masticate in proper rhythm could be interpreted as a treasonous act against both culinary and cosmic order. The bizarre world of musical mastication requirements reveals how medieval royalty managed to complicate even the most basic biological functions through elaborate ceremonial protocols. The scene before you is surreal beyond imagination. A full orchestra positioned strategically around the royal dining table, their instruments poised to accompany not just the meal service, but the actual consumption process itself. You watch as the king lifts a morsel of roasted pheasant to his lips, and immediately a gentle melody begins, timed precisely to match his chewing rhythm. The musicians, their eyes fixed intently on the royal jaw, adjust their tempo to synchronize with each mastication, creating a musical score written not in notes but in the grinding patterns of royal teeth. This extraordinary practice emerged from medieval theories about the connection between sound, digestion, and spiritual harmony. You discover that court physicians, influenced by ancient Greek theories about music's healing properties, convinced monarchs that proper digestion required specific musical accompaniment to stimulate the body's natural processes. The stomach, they argued, was like a musical instrument that needed to be tuned through external harmonies to function at peak efficiency. The mainstream historical fact underlying musical mastication lies in the genuine medieval belief in the doctrine of correspondences, the idea that earthly activities should mirror celestial harmonies. Music was considered the earthly reflection of divine order, and eating, as a daily necessity for maintaining life, required musical accompaniment to ensure it aligned with cosmic principles. This wasn't mere entertainment. It was considered essential medicine for maintaining royal health and spiritual well-being. You observe the incredible complexity of the musical arrangements required for different types of food. Tough meats demanded vigorous, rhythmic compositions that encouraged thorough chewing, while delicate fish required gentle, flowing melodies that promoted careful consumption. The court composer held a position of tremendous responsibility, required to create not just entertainment music, but therapeutic eating soundtracks that could literally determine the success of royal digestion. The training required for musicians participating in mastication accompaniment was extraordinarily demanding. You watch as performers learn to read not just musical notation, but the subtle facial cues and jaw movements of royal diners. They practiced for hours, studying the chewing patterns of different individuals, learning to anticipate the rhythm changes that occurred with various foods, and developing the ability to adjust their performance instantaneously based on the royal mouth's requirements. These specialized instruments developed for dining music created entirely new categories of musical equipment. You discover harps designed for gentle food accompaniment, with strings tuned to frequencies believed to promote healthy digestion. Special drums provided rhythmic support for tougher foods, while wind instruments offered melodic accompaniment for soups and liquid consumption. Some courts employed musical innovation specialists whose sole purpose was creating eating-specific instruments. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this practice even more extraordinary involves the development of digestive symphonies, complex musical compositions specifically designed to accompany multi-course royal meals. These weren't simple background music, they were elaborate orchestral works that followed the progression of dining, with movements timed to match different courses and eating phases. Some of these compositions lasted for hours and required coordinated performances by dozens of musicians. The international diplomatic challenges created by musical mastication requirements were substantial. You witnessed the confusion of foreign ambassadors attending royal dinners, unprepared for the musical accompaniment to their eating. Some visitors found the practice so distracting they could barely consume their food, while others attempted to eat in rhythm with unfamiliar musical styles, creating awkward dining experiences that could affect diplomatic relationships. The medical theories supporting musical mastication became increasingly elaborate over time. You observe court physicians developing complex theories about how different musical modes affected various digestive organs, with specific scales prescribed for liver health, stomach function, and intestinal harmony. They maintain detailed records of which musical compositions produce the best digestive outcomes for different monarchs, creating personalized eating soundtracks based on individual medical needs. Historians still argue whether musical mastication represented genuine medical belief, or evolved as another method of demonstrating royal power and cultural sophistication. The practice required enormous resources, full-time musicians, specialized instruments, and constant coordination, making it a visible demonstration of wealth and the ability to transform even basic biological functions into elaborate cultural performances. The seasonal variations in eating music reflected both medical theories and religious observances. You discover that different times of year require different musical approaches to dining, with winter compositions designed to stimulate sluggish digestion during cold months, while summer arrangements promoted cooling and gentle eating during hot weather. Religious seasons brought their own musical requirements, with Lent demanding penitential eating music and feast days calling for celebratory digestive symphonies. The psychological impact of musical mastication on royal diners was profound and varied. You watch some monarchs becoming so dependent on musical accompaniment that they found eating in silence nearly impossible, their digestive systems seemingly conditioned to require musical stimulation. Others developed sophisticated preferences for specific composers or musical styles, becoming connoisseurs of eating music with opinions as strong as their views on food preparation. The economic implications of maintaining musical mastication programs were enormous. You observe royal courts employing dozens of specialized musicians, composers, and instrument makers dedicated solely to dining accompaniment. The cost of maintaining these musical dining programs often exceeded the expense of the food itself, making musical mastication one of the most expensive aspects of royal household management. The architectural requirements for musical mastication influenced palace design and dining room construction. You notice specially designed acoustic chambers that optimize sound quality for eating music, with careful attention to reverberation times and sound distribution that would enhance the dining experience. Some royal dining rooms were built like concert halls, with the acoustical requirements of musical mastication taking precedence over traditional decorative considerations. The competitive aspects of musical mastication created interesting dynamics among royal courts. You witness kingdoms attempting to outdo each other with increasingly elaborate eating music programs, commissioning famous composers to create signature digestive symphonies and employing renowned musicians specifically for dining accompaniment. These musical dining competitions became matters of national pride and diplomatic prestige. The decline of musical mastication came gradually as changing medical theories and practical considerations made the practice seem increasingly unnecessary and cumbersome. You observe the slow abandonment of elaborate eating music programs. Though some courts maintained simplified versions well into later centuries, and certain ceremonial occasions continued to feature traditional digestive musical accompaniment. The legacy of musical mastication appears in surviving court records and musical compositions specifically designated for dining purposes. You discover that some of these eating symphonies were later adapted for regular concert performance, stripped of their digestive purposes, but retained for their musical merit. The practice influenced broader relationships between music and daily life, contributing to the development of background music concepts that continue in modern restaurants and dining establishments. As you absorb the full implications of this extraordinary dining tradition, you begin to understand how royal culture could transform literally any human activity, even the unconscious act of chewing food, into an opportunity for cultural expression, medical intervention, and social demonstration that required the coordination of dozens of specialists and represented one of the most elaborate attempts in human history to orchestrate the basic biological functions of staying alive. You step into a world where the very colour of your food could determine your fate, where a misplaced red berry on a Wednesday could be interpreted as a declaration of war, and where royal dining tables resembled carefully orchestrated rainbows with each hue, carrying profound symbolic weight that could topple governments or secure divine blessing. The intricate system of colour-coded food symbolism transformed every meal into a complex navigation of political allegiances, religious observances, and cosmic alignments that required encyclopedic knowledge to survive. The elaborate colour wheel displayed before the royal table isn't decorative art. It's a survival guide that determines which foods can be consumed on specific days, during particular seasons, and in the presence of certain courtiers. You observe servants consulting detailed charts that map the relationship between food colours, celestial movements, political situations, and spiritual requirements. Creating a dining experience so complex it requires dedicated colour coordinators to prevent catastrophic symbolic violations. The red foods arranged on the golden platters before you aren't simply appealing to the eye. They're making specific political statements about military strength, passion, and divine favour. You watch as courtiers carefully note which nobles choose red foods on particular days, understanding that consuming crimson berries during peace negotiations might be interpreted as warmongering, while avoiding red meats during military campaigns could suggest cowardice or lack of commitment to victory. The mainstream historical fact underlying colour-coded food symbolism stems from medieval understanding of the doctrine of signatures, the belief that God marked all natural objects with visual signs indicating their spiritual and medicinal properties. Colours weren't merely aesthetic choices, they were divine communications that revealed hidden truths about the food's effects on body, soul, and political fortune. Eating foods of inappropriate colours could disrupt cosmic harmony and invite disaster. You discover the sophisticated theological framework that governed colour choices in royal dining. White foods represented purity, spiritual elevation, and connection to divine grace. making them mandatory during religious holidays and periods of penance. Gold and yellow food symbolized wealth, divine blessing, and royal authority, requiring careful timing to avoid accusations of arrogance or inappropriate displays of power during humble occasions. The seasonal color requirements created incredibly complex menu planning challenges. You observe kitchen staff maintaining detailed calendars that specify which colors are appropriate for each day of the year, taking into account religious observances, astronomical events, and political circumstances. Spring demanded green foods to harmonize with renewal and growth, while autumn required browns and oranges that reflected the natural cycles of harvest and preparation for winter's challenges. The international diplomatic implications of color symbolism created unique challenges for state dinners and foreign relations. You witness elaborate negotiations between royal courts about appropriate color schemes for diplomatic meals, with misunderstandings about symbolic meaning potentially damaging important relationships. A foreign ambassador's choice to wear purple while consuming green foods might be interpreted as a subtle insult or territorial claim, requiring careful diplomatic interpretation and damage control. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this system even more fascinating involves the development of color spies. Court officials whose primary responsibility was monitoring the food color choices of various nobles and interpreting their symbolic implications. These individuals maintained detailed records of who ate what colors when, creating intelligence networks that used dining choices to predict political loyalties, romantic interests, and potential conspiracies. The medical theories supporting color-coded eating became increasingly elaborate as court physicians developed complex relationships between food colors and bodily health. You observe doctors prescribing specific color diets for different ailments, yellow foods for liver complaints, red foods for blood disorders, and green foods for digestive problems. The symbolic and medical meanings often conflicted, creating situations where political necessity demanded colors that contradicted medical advice. The preparation challenges created by color requirements transformed royal kitchens into laboratories of symbolic cooking. You watch chefs developing techniques for enhancing or modifying natural food colors to meet ceremonial requirements, using various dyes, cooking methods, and presentation techniques to achieve the precise symbolic messages demanded by court protocol. Some dishes were valued more for their color than their taste, with aesthetic symbolism taking precedence over culinary excellence. Historians still argue whether color-coded food symbolism reflected genuine religious and medical beliefs or evolved as another method of social control and exclusion. The complexity of the system created barriers that separated those with access to color education from those without, reinforcing social hierarchies through seemingly innocent dietary choices while providing endless opportunities for political manipulation through symbolic interpretation. The training required for navigating color symbolism was extensive and began in early childhood for noble families. You observe young aristocrats studying color wheels, memorizing symbolic associations, and practicing appropriate food choices for different occasions. This education often included theological instruction about the spiritual significance of colors and political training about their diplomatic implications, creating a generation fluent in the complex language of chromatic dining. The economic impact of color-coded dining requirements was substantial, as you discover that achieving specific color combinations often required expensive ingredients, specialized preparation techniques, and constant menu modifications based on changing symbolic needs. Some foods were valued primarily for their color properties rather than nutritional content, creating markets for exotic ingredients that served more symbolic than practical purposes. The psychological effects of constant color consciousness during dining created interesting behavioral patterns among royal court members. You watch courtiers developing obsessive relationships with food colours, some becoming so anxious about symbolic violations that they would barely eat, while others used colour choices as subtle methods of rebellion or political statement-making that couldn't be directly prosecuted but carried clear symbolic meaning. The religious dimensions of colour symbolism connected to broader medieval beliefs about the spiritual significance of visual phenomena. You discover that food colours were believed to affect not just physical health but spiritual condition, with different hues thought to promote various virtues or vices. Consuming too much of certain colours could allegedly lead to spiritual corruption, while proper colour balance was considered essential for maintaining divine favour. The artistic and decorative possibilities created by colour requirements led to the development of elaborate food presentation techniques that transformed royal dining into visual spectacles. You observe meals arranged like paintings, with careful attention to colour harmony, contrast, and symbolic messaging that turned dining tables into galleries of edible art, where aesthetic achievement was measured by symbolic accuracy rather than traditional artistic principles. The decline of rigid, colour-coded food symbolism came gradually as changing philosophical perspectives and practical considerations made the system seem increasingly burdensome and unnecessary. You observe the relaxation of colour requirements, though vestiges of these traditions persisted in ceremonial occasions and formal court dinners, where symbolic meaning remained important for maintaining traditional protocols. The competitive aspects of colour mastery created interesting dynamics among royal courts, with kingdoms attempting to develop increasingly sophisticated colour symbolism systems that demonstrated cultural refinement and intellectual superiority. You witness elaborate displays of chromatic dining expertise during international visits, with courts competing to create the most symbolically appropriate and visually stunning meals that showcase their mastery of colour-coded food culture. The legacy of colour-coded food symbolism appears in surviving court records, menu descriptions, and artistic depictions of royal meals that reveal the extraordinary attention paid to chromatic details. You discover that some of these colour traditions influenced broader cultural relationships between visual aesthetics and dining, contributing to modern concepts of food presentation and the psychological effects of colour on appetite and dining experience. As you contemplate the weight of symbolic meaning that surrounded something as basic as food colour, you begin to understand how royal culture could transform even the visual aspects of eating into complex systems of communication, social control, and spiritual practice that required constant vigilance and created a world where a simple meal became a carefully choreographed performance of political, religious, and cosmic significance. You witness one of the most elaborate and sacred ceremonies in royal dining culture, the intricate protocols governing the distribution of royal leftovers, where the king's uneaten food becomes the centre of a complex ritual that could determine the fate of entire households and reveal the hidden power structures that governed medieval court life. The remnants on the royal plate aren't simply scraps to be discarded. They are precious relics imbued with royal essence that require careful handling, precise distribution, and elaborate ceremonies that transform garbage into gold. The scene before you resembles a religious service more than a clean-up operation. You observe dozens of specially trained servants, each with clearly defined roles in the leftover distribution ceremony, approaching the royal table with the reverence typically reserved for handling sacred artifacts. The king's partially eaten bread, the wine remaining in his goblet, and even the crumbs scattered around his place setting are treated as objects of tremendous value and spiritual significance. The hierarchy governing leftover distribution reflects the complex social structure of medieval court life with startling precision. You watch as the Lord Chamberlain carefully examines each remaining morsel, determining its appropriate destination based on elaborate protocols that take into account the recipient's rank, their current standing in royal favour, and the symbolic significance of different food types. A crust of bread touched by royal lips carries more value than entire meals prepared for lesser nobles. The mainstream historical fact underlying this practice stems from medieval beliefs about the transfer of royal essence through physical contact. Food that had been blessed by the king's touch was believed to carry healing properties, divine protection, and political significance that could benefit those fortunate enough to receive it. This wasn't merely about avoiding waste, it was about distributing royal power and blessing through the medium of partially consumed food. You observe the meticulous categorization process that governs leftover distribution. Foods that the king had bitten directly carried the highest value and were reserved for the most favoured courtiers or used for specific ceremonial purposes. Items he had touched but not consumed held lesser, but still significant value, while foods from his table that hadn't received direct royal contact formed a third tier of distribution that could still convey meaningful favour to recipients. The religious dimensions of leftover distribution created fascinating parallels to communion and relic veneration. You watch as court chaplains bless the distribution ceremony, transforming the king's leftovers into sacred objects through formal religious ritual. Some pieces of royal bread were preserved indefinitely, treated like holy relics that could provide protection and blessing to their possessors, while others were consumed immediately in ceremonies that resembled communion services. The economic implications of the leftover distribution system were substantial and far-reaching. You discover that receiving royal leftovers carried monetary value that could be converted into cash, political favours, or social advancement opportunities. Some courtiers built their entire careers around positioning themselves favourably in the leftover hierarchy, understanding that regular access to royal scraps could provide more reliable income than formal salaries or land grants. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this system even more extraordinary involves the development of leftover insurance, informal networks where courtiers would trade their rights to different types of royal leftovers based on their personal preferences and strategic needs. A noble might trade his rights to leftover meat for another's claim to royal wine remnants, creating complex barter systems that operated parallel to the formal court economy. The international diplomatic aspects of leftover distribution created unique opportunities and challenges for foreign relations. You witness visiting ambassadors and foreign dignitaries being offered portions of royal leftovers as marks of special honour, with the specific items chosen sending carefully calculated diplomatic messages. Offering a foreign envoy the king's leftover bread might signal friendship, while providing only items that hadn't received direct royal contact could indicate a more distant relationship. The preparation and presentation requirements for leftover distribution demanded specialized skills and equipment. You observe servants using special utensils to handle royal remnants, storing them in designated containers that preserved their sacred quality, and maintaining detailed records of what had been distributed to whom. Some courts employed specialized leftover cataloguers whose sole responsibility was tracking the movement of royal food remnants and ensuring proper distribution protocols. Historians still argue whether the elaborate leftover distribution system reflected genuine beliefs about royal sacred power, or served primarily as another method of maintaining social control and loyalty through the distribution of symbolic rewards. The practice created dependencies that bound courtiers to the royal presence while providing monarchs with a daily opportunity to demonstrate favour or displeasure through leftover allocation decisions. The seasonal and ceremonial variations in leftover distribution reflected the calendar of court life and religious observances. You discover that different types of royal leftovers were considered appropriate for different occasions, with Christmas remnants carrying special blessing power, while Easter leftovers were believed to provide protection against evil. Fast day leftovers were particularly prized for their spiritual significance, even though they might be smaller in quantity. The medical theories surrounding royal leftover consumption added scientific justification to the practice. You watch court physicians arguing that food blessed by royal contact carried healing properties that could cure various ailments, with different types of leftovers prescribed for different medical conditions. Some doctors maintained that consuming royal leftovers regularly could strengthen the immune system and provide protection against plague and other diseases. The psychological impact of the leftover distribution system on court participants was profound and varied. You observe the intense competition and anxiety that surrounded leftover allocation, with courtiers developing elaborate strategies for positioning themselves favourably, while managing the disappointment and jealousy that could result from unfavourable distributions. Some individuals became obsessed with leftover politics, interpreting every allocation decision as a signal about their standing in royal favour. The architectural and logistical requirements for proper leftover distribution influenced palace design and court organisation. You notice specialised storage areas for royal remnants, distribution chambers where allocation ceremonies took place, and record-keeping facilities that tracked the complex flows of leftover goods. Some palaces included dedicated leftover kitchens where royal remnants could be prepared for secondary distribution or preservation. The artistic and ceremonial aspects of leftover distribution elevated the practice beyond mere food handling into elaborate court theatre. You watch as distribution ceremonies included musical accompaniment, formal presentations, and ritualized exchanges that transformed leftover allocation into entertainment and spectacle. The containers used for leftover storage and presentation were often works of art in their own right, decorated with precious metals and gems that reflected the value placed on their contents. The decline of elaborate leftover distribution ceremonies came gradually, as changing social attitudes and practical considerations made the system seem increasingly complex and unnecessary. You observe the slow simplification of leftover protocols. Though elements of these traditions persisted in modified forms that continued to recognize the symbolic value of royal food contact while reducing the administrative burden of complex distribution systems, the competitive dynamics between different courts led to increasingly elaborate leftover distribution systems as kingdoms attempted to demonstrate their sophistication and spiritual understanding through more complex protocols. You witness courts developing signature approaches to leftover ceremony that became matters of national pride and cultural identity, with visiting dignitaries specifically observing leftover practices as indicators of court refinement and royal power. The legacy of royal leftover distribution appears in surviving court records, ceremonial descriptions, and artistic depictions that reveal the extraordinary attention paid to every aspect of royal food consumption and its aftermath. You discover that some elements of these traditions influenced broader cultural attitudes about food waste, sharing, and the symbolic power of consumption that continue to shape dining customs in various forms. As you contemplate the elaborate ceremonies that surrounded something as mundane as leftover food, you begin to understand how royal culture could transform literally any aspect of daily life into opportunities for political maneuvering, social positioning, and spiritual practice that required constant attention and created a world where even garbage became a medium for expressing power, favour, and the complex relationships that govern medieval court society. You find yourself transported into a dining hall where the very timing of meals has been surrendered to the movements of distant planets and stars. where royal hunger must yield to cosmic rhythms, and where the simple act of eating breakfast might require waiting until the moon reaches a specific position in the sky. The bizarre world of astronomical dining timing mandates reveals how medieval royalty transformed their daily sustenance into elaborate ceremonies governed by celestial mechanics rather than biological needs. The ornate astrolabe positioned prominently beside the royal dining table isn't decorative art. It's the most important piece of equipment determining when the king can safely consume his next meal. You watch as court astronomers huddle around complex charts, calculating the precise moments when celestial alignments will permit royal consumption without risking cosmic displeasure or disrupting the delicate harmony between earthly actions and heavenly movements. The scene before you defies every modern understanding of practical meal scheduling. You observe servants maintaining elaborate feasts in various states of readiness. Some dishes growing cold while others are kept warm over carefully tended fires, all waiting for the astronomical calculations that will determine the precise moment when royal consumption can safely begin. The king himself, despite obvious hunger, sits patiently as astronomers debate whether Venus has achieved proper alignment with Jupiter to permit the consumption of roasted fowl. The mainstream historical fact underlying astronomical dining timing stems from medieval beliefs about the profound connections between celestial movements and earthly events. Court astronomers, influenced by classical theories about planetary influences on human health and fortune, convinced monarchs that eating at astronomically inappropriate times could disrupt bodily humours, invite political disaster, or even threaten the stability of the kingdom itself. The complexity of astronomical meal timing required dedicated court positions and elaborate bureaucratic structures. You discover the Royal Astronomical Dining Coordinator, a position of tremendous responsibility that combined knowledge of celestial mechanics, nutritional theory, and court protocol. This individual maintained detailed charts correlating different foods with favourable planetary positions, creating dining schedules that could extend meals across unusual hours or compress multiple courses into narrow windows of cosmic opportunity. The seasonal variations in astronomical dining created particularly challenging logistics during certain times of year. You observe winter periods when favourable dining alignments might occur only during inconvenient nighttime hours, forcing royal households to conduct elaborate midnight feasts because the stars demanded sustenance at precisely that moment. Summer brought its own challenges, with some astronomical requirements demanding dawn meals or late afternoon dining that conflicted with traditional court schedules. The international diplomatic implications of astronomical dining timing created unique challenges for foreign relations and state visits. You witness the complex negotiations required when visiting dignitaries arrived during astronomically unfavourable periods for royal dining, with elaborate protocols developed for handling situations where cosmic timing conflicted with diplomatic necessity. Some international incidents were triggered by misunderstandings about astronomical dining requirements. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this practice even more extraordinary involves the development of emergency astronomical override protocols, procedures for handling situations where urgent political or military crises demanded immediate royal attention during astronomically inappropriate dining times. These protocols included elaborate purification ceremonies, protective rituals, and sometimes required substitute rulers to handle earthly affairs while the true monarch waited for cosmic permission to eat. The medical theories supporting astronomical dining timing became increasingly sophisticated as court physicians developed complex relationships between planetary positions and digestive health. You observe doctors creating detailed charts showing how different celestial configurations affected various organs, with specific astronomical moments prescribed for optimal digestion of different food types. Mars rising was considered ideal for consuming red meats, while Venus ascending favoured delicate fruits and sweets. The economic implications of astronomical dining requirements were substantial, as you discover the enormous costs associated with maintaining multiple meal preparations simultaneously while waiting for appropriate cosmic timing, food spoilage, servant overtime, and the specialized equipment required for astronomical calculations created budget categories that sometimes exceeded the cost of the actual food being served, making astronomical dining one of the most expensive aspects of royal household management. The training required for managing astronomical dining involved extensive education in both celestial mechanics and practical logistics. You watch specialized servants learning to read astronomical charts, calculate planetary positions, and coordinate complex timing requirements while maintaining food quality and court protocol. These individuals often came from scholarly backgrounds, representing a unique fusion of academic knowledge and practical service. Historians still argue whether astronomical dining timing reflected genuine beliefs about cosmic influence on digestion, or served primarily as another method of demonstrating royal power through the ability to subordinate basic biological needs to elaborate ceremonial requirements. The practice certainly showcased the resources available to royal households and their commitment to transcending ordinary human limitations through divine connection. The psychological impact of astronomical dining on royal participants was profound and varied. You observe some monarchs becoming deeply dependent on cosmic timing for their eating habits, developing anxiety about consuming food during astronomically inappropriate moments. Others struggled with the conflict between natural hunger and cosmic requirements, leading to complex relationships with food that extended far beyond normal appetite satisfaction. The architectural requirements for astronomical dining influenced palace design and dining room construction. You notice specialized observation chambers connected to dining halls, allowing astronomers to monitor celestial movements while coordinating meal timing. Some royal dining rooms included built-in astronomical instruments, with ceiling designs that incorporated star charts and planetary tracking mechanisms essential for proper dining coordination. The religious dimensions of astronomical dining connected to broader medieval beliefs about divine order and cosmic harmony. You discover that meal timing was considered a form of prayer and worship, with proper astronomical alignment demonstrating royal obedience to divine will and cosmic law. Court chaplains often blessed astronomical dining calculations, transforming meal scheduling into religious observance that combined earthly sustenance with spiritual devotion. The competitive aspects of astronomical dining created interesting dynamics among royal courts, with kingdoms attempting to develop increasingly sophisticated cosmic timing systems that demonstrated cultural advancement and divine favour. You witness elaborate displays of astronomical dining expertise during international visits, with courts competing to showcase their mastery of celestial meal coordination as indicators of royal wisdom and cosmic connection. The practical challenges of astronomical dining during military campaigns and travel created portable astronomical dining systems that could maintain cosmic timing requirements away from palace observatories. You observe mobile astronomical equipment, travelling astronomers, and simplified timing protocols that allowed royal households to maintain celestial dining coordination even during diplomatic missions or military expeditions. The decline of astronomical dining timing came gradually as changing scientific understanding and practical considerations made the system seem increasingly complex and unnecessary. You witness the abandonment of elaborate cosmic timing requirements. Though some courts maintained simplified versions of astronomical meal coordination for ceremonial occasions and religious holidays where cosmic timing retained symbolic importance, the artistic and decorative aspects of astronomical dining equipment created beautiful and functional instruments that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. You discover elaborate astrolabes, decorative star charts, and ornate timing devices that transformed astronomical dining coordination into visual spectacles, while maintaining their essential function in determining appropriate meal timing based on celestial movements. The legacy of astronomical dining timing appears in surviving court records, astronomical charts, and artistic depictions that reveal the extraordinary attention paid to cosmic coordination of royal eating habits. You find that some elements of these traditions influence broader cultural relationships between timing and dining, contributing to modern concepts of scheduled meals and the psychological importance of eating at appropriate times. As you contemplate the elaborate cosmic choreography that surrounded something as basic as meal timing, you begin to understand how royal culture could transform even the scheduling of sustenance into complex demonstrations of divine connection, scientific sophistication, and the ability to transcend ordinary human limitations through elaborate ceremonial practices that elevated eating from biological necessity to cosmic participation. You enter a dining hall where the simple act of breaking bread has been transformed into a complex political ceremony that could determine the fate of nations, where the angle of a knife cut could signal declaration of war, and where the distribution of crust versus crumb carried such profound meaning that entire diplomatic corps were trained in the subtle art of bread interpretation. The great bread-breaking protocols reveal how medieval royalty managed to turn humanity's most basic food into one of the most politically charged substances on Earth. The magnificent loaf positioned at the centre of the royal table isn't merely sustenance, it's a weapon of political communication more powerful than armies, a symbol of divine authority more sacred than crowns, and a test of loyalty more revealing than sworn oaths. You watch as the royal breadmaster approaches this seemingly innocent object with tools that gleam like surgical instruments, each implement designed for specific cuts that will send carefully calculated messages to everyone present at the royal feast. The protocols governing who could slice royal bread were so complex, they required dedicated court positions and years of specialized training. You observe the keeper of the royal blade, a position that carried enormous responsibility and political significance, as he prepares to make the first ceremonial cut. This isn't simply about dividing food for consumption, it's about demonstrating royal authority, controlling the flow of symbolic power, and managing the delicate relationships that held medieval kingdoms together through the medium of wheat and flour. The mainstream historical fact underlying bread-breaking protocols stems from the genuine political and religious significance of bread in medieval society. As the primary food source for most of the population, bread represented life itself, and controlling its distribution meant controlling survival. When royalty participated in bread-breaking ceremonies, they were literally demonstrating their power over life and death, their role as divine intermediaries, and their responsibility for their subjects' welfare. The tools used for royal bread-breaking were masterpieces of craftsmanship and symbolic meaning. You discover elaborately decorated knives with handles carved from precious materials, each blade consecrated through religious ceremonies and maintained by specialist servants whose sole responsibility was ensuring proper bread-cutting implements. Some royal bread knives were passed down through generations, accumulating political and spiritual significance that made them more valuable than many crown jewels. The directional requirements for bread cutting created incredibly complex geometric protocols. You watch as the breadmaster carefully calculates angles, ensuring that the first cut aligns with specific cardinal directions that correspond to the kingdom's territorial claims, political alliances, and spiritual orientations. A cut made toward the east might signal support for crusade efforts, while westward cuts could indicate focus on domestic concerns or relationships with Atlantic trading partners. The distribution hierarchy for bread pieces reflected the complex social structure of medieval court life with mathematical precision. You observe servants consulting detailed charts that specify which courtiers receive portions from the top of the loaf versus the bottom, who gets pieces with more crust versus more crumb, and how the size of each portion communicates the recipient's current standing in royal favour. These aren't random distributions, they are carefully calculated political statements. The quirky historical tidbit that makes bread protocol even more fascinating involves the development of bread intelligence networks, informal systems where courtiers would analyse the bread distributions at royal meals to predict political changes, identify rising or falling favourites, and anticipate major policy announcements. Experienced court observers could read bread distribution patterns like political barometers, using crust allocation to forecast everything from military campaigns to marriage negotiations. The international diplomatic implications of bread breaking created unique challenges for foreign relations. You witness the elaborate negotiations required when foreign dignitaries attended royal meals, with careful consideration given to how bread distribution would be interpreted by visiting ambassadors, the type of bread offered to foreign guests, the cutting ceremony they were permitted to witness, and the portions they received all carried diplomatic significance that could affect trade relationships and military alliances. The religious dimensions of bread breaking connected directly to Christian communion traditions, creating fascinating parallels between royal dining and sacred ritual. You observe court chaplains blessing bread-cutting ceremonies, transforming political protocol into religious observance that demonstrated the divine nature of royal authority. Some courts required prayer before bread breaking, treating the ceremony as a form of communion that reinforced the sacred relationship between monarch and subjects. The seasonal and ceremonial variations in bread breaking reflected the agricultural calendar and religious observances. You discover that different times of year required different bread-cutting protocols, with harvest celebrations demanding elaborate bread ceremonies that honoured agricultural abundance, while periods of scarcity required modified rituals that acknowledged hardship while maintaining royal dignity and political authority. Historians still argue whether the elaborate bread-breaking protocols reflected genuine beliefs about the sacred nature of royal authority, or served primarily as methods of social control and political communication. The ceremonies certainly provided daily opportunities for monarchs to demonstrate their power, while creating dependencies that bound courtiers to the royal presence through the distribution of both literal and symbolic sustenance. The economic implications of maintaining proper bread-breaking protocols were substantial. You observe the enormous costs associated with producing ceremonial breads that met symbolic requirements while maintaining the specialized equipment, trained personnel, and elaborate ceremonies that surrounded their consumption. Some royal households employed dedicated bakers whose sole responsibility was creating bread suitable for political ceremony rather than ordinary consumption. The psychological impact of bread-breaking ceremonies on court participants was profound and varied. You watch courtiers developing intense relationships with bread symbolism, some becoming obsessed with their position in distribution hierarchies, while others used bread analysis as methods of political survival and advancement. The daily bread ceremony became a source of both anxiety and opportunity for ambitious nobles seeking to interpret and influence royal favour. The training required for proper bread protocol involved extensive education in both practical cutting techniques and symbolic interpretation. You observe specialized instructors teaching the complex skills required for ceremonial bread handling, including knife work, distribution mathematics, and the subtle art of reading political meaning into flower-based communications. These skills were often passed down through families, creating hereditary specialists in bread ceremony management. The architectural requirements for proper bread breaking influenced palace design and dining room construction. You notice specially designed bread altars where cutting ceremonies took place, storage facilities for ceremonial bread implements, and spatial arrangements that allowed all participants to observe the symbolic significance of bread distribution. Some royal dining rooms were organized around bread ceremony requirements rather than traditional architectural principles. The artistic and decorative possibilities created by bread-breaking ceremonies led to elaborate presentations that transformed utilitarian food into works of political art. You observe breads shaped into symbolic forms, decorated with edible representations of royal heraldry, and presented in ceremonial displays that combined sustenance with propaganda in ways that made every meal a political statement and every bite an affirmation of loyalty. Also, the competitive aspects of bread ceremony created interesting dynamics among royal courts, with kingdoms developing increasingly sophisticated bread protocols that demonstrated cultural refinement and political sophistication. You witness elaborate displays of bread-breaking expertise during international visits, with courts competing to showcase their mastery of ceremonial cutting techniques and symbolic distribution systems. The decline of elaborate bread-breaking protocols came gradually as changing political structures and practical considerations made the system seem increasingly complex and unnecessary. You observe the slow simplification of bread ceremonies. Though elements of these traditions persisted in modified forms that continued to recognize the symbolic importance of shared bread, while reducing the administrative burden of complex cutting and distribution protocols, the legacy of royal bread breaking appears in surviving court records, ceremonial descriptions, and artistic depictions that reveal the extraordinary attention paid to every aspect of bread handling and distribution. You discover that some elements of these traditions influence broader cultural attitudes about sharing food, hospitality, and the symbolic power of communal eating that continue to shape dining customs and social relationships in various forms. As you contemplate the elaborate political theatre that surrounded something as fundamental as breaking bread, you begin to understand how royal culture could transform even the most basic human activities into complex demonstrations of power, authority, and social organization that required constant vigilance and created a world where every crumb carried meaning and every cut could change the course of history. You find yourself in a dining chamber where the temperature of royal beverages has become a matter of life and death, where servants risk execution for serving wine that's 3 degrees too warm, and where the pursuit of perfect drink temperature has driven monarchs to engineering feats that would challenge modern refrigeration technology. The obsessive world of royal beverage temperature control reveals how medieval courts transformed the simple act of quenching thirst into elaborate scientific endeavours that required armies of specialists and resources that could fund entire military campaigns. The scene before you resembles a medieval laboratory more than a dining room. You observe an intricate network of copper pipes snaking through the walls, carrying precisely chilled water from underground ice chambers to cooling vessels positioned strategically around the royal table. Servants armed with specialized thermometers, primitive but surprisingly accurate instruments, constantly monitor the temperature of every beverage, while others race between ice houses and dining halls carrying precious frozen cargo that might have travelled hundreds of miles to reach the royal lips. The king's wine goblet sits within an elaborate cooling mechanism that looks like a medieval air conditioning unit. You watch as servants carefully lower bottles into precisely calibrated ice baths, rotate them at specific intervals to ensure even cooling, and monitor their progress with the intensity of alchemists pursuing the philosopher's stone. The temperature requirements aren't merely preferences, they're royal decrees backed by detailed scientific theories and enforced with punishments that could destroy the careers and lives. The mainstream historical fact underlying royal beverage temperature obsessions stems from medieval medical theories that connected drink temperature to both physical health and political fortune. Court physicians, influenced by ancient Greek theories about bodily humours, convinced monarchs that consuming beverages at incorrect temperatures could disrupt internal balance, invite disease, and even compromise royal authority by demonstrating insufficient attention to divine harmony and cosmic order. The logistics of maintaining proper beverage temperatures required engineering solutions that pushed medieval technology to its absolute limits. You discover elaborate icehouse networks that stored winter ice in underground chambers designed to preserve frozen water through the hottest summer months. These weren't simple storage facilities. They were sophisticated refrigeration systems with multiple chambers, drainage systems, and insulation techniques that represented cutting-edge technology for their time. The transportation of ice to royal courts created entire industries and trade networks dedicated to supplying frozen water. You observe caravans carrying ice from mountain sources, ships equipped with specialized cooling holds, and networks of ice stations that maintained cold storage facilities along major trade routes. Some kingdoms established diplomatic relationships primarily to secure reliable ice supplies, making frozen water a strategic resource as valuable as gold or military supplies. The specialized equipment developed for beverage temperature control represented masterpieces of medieval engineering and craftsmanship. You watch servants using elaborate cooling vessels designed with multiple chambers, ingenious stirring mechanisms that promoted even temperature distribution, and measuring devices that could detect temperature variations with surprising precision. Some courts employed dedicated instrument makers whose sole responsibility was creating and maintaining temperature control equipment. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this obsession even more extraordinary involves the development of beverage temperature insurance, complex systems where multiple servants were assigned to monitor each drink, with backup cooling systems and emergency protocols designed to prevent temperature disasters. Courts maintained detailed records of beverage temperatures throughout meals, creating documentation that resembled modern quality control procedures more than medieval dining records. The international diplomatic implications of beverage temperature requirements created unique challenges for foreign relations. You witness visiting ambassadors receiving detailed briefings about proper drinking temperatures before attending royal dinners, with diplomatic incidents sometimes triggered by misunderstandings about temperature preferences. Some courts developed special protocols for accommodating foreign guests who might not appreciate precisely chilled beverages, creating diplomatic serving systems that could satisfy both local requirements and international courtesy. The seasonal challenges of maintaining proper beverage temperatures tested the limits of medieval technology and resources. You observe the extraordinary measures required during summer months when natural cooling was most difficult and ice most precious, with some courts relocating entire dining operations to underground chambers or mountain retreats to maintain proper beverage temperatures. Winter presented opposite challenges, with some drinks requiring warming systems as elaborate as the cooling mechanisms used during hot weather. The medical theories supporting temperature-specific drinking became increasingly complex as court physicians developed elaborate relationships between beverage temperature and various health conditions. You discover detailed charts prescribing specific temperatures for different ailments, with cold drinks recommended for fever reduction, while warm beverages were prescribed for digestive problems. Some doctors maintained that incorrect beverage temperatures could cause everything from political instability to romantic difficulties. Historians still argue whether the elaborate beverage temperature systems reflected genuine medical beliefs, or served primarily as demonstrations of royal power and technological sophistication. The enormous resources required to maintain precise temperature control certainly showcase the wealth and scientific advancement of royal courts, while providing daily opportunities to demonstrate the lengths to which monarchs would go to transcend ordinary human limitations. The economic impact of maintaining beverage temperature systems was staggering. You observe entire departments of royal households dedicated to temperature control, with specialized servants, expensive equipment, and enormous ongoing costs for ice procurement and transportation. Some kingdoms spent more on beverage temperature maintenance than on military equipment, making properly chilled drinks one of the most expensive aspects of royal lifestyle. The training required for beverage temperature specialists involved extensive education in both scientific principles and practical techniques. You watch apprentices learning to judge temperatures by touch, memorizing the optimal temperatures for different beverages, and mastering the complex timing required to achieve perfect cooling or warming at the precise moment of royal consumption. These skills were often closely guarded trade secrets passed down through specialized families. The psychological impact of beverage temperature obsessions on royal participants was profound and sometimes destructive. You observe monarchs developing such dependence on perfectly temperature-controlled drinks that they became unable to consume beverages outside their precise specifications, creating anxiety and health problems that extended far beyond ordinary dining preferences. Some rulers became prisoners of their own temperature requirements, unable to travel or participate in normal activities without elaborate cooling equipment. The architectural requirements for proper beverage temperature control influenced palace design and construction. You notice specially designed cooling chambers, elaborate plumbing systems for circulating chilled water, and storage facilities that could maintain ice supplies throughout the year. Some royal residences were built around the requirements of beverage temperature control, with entire wings dedicated to the infrastructure necessary for properly chilled drinks. The competitive aspects of beverage temperature technology created interesting dynamics among royal courts, with kingdoms attempting to develop increasingly sophisticated cooling and heating systems that demonstrated scientific advancement and royal sophistication. You witness elaborate displays of temperature control expertise during international visits, with courts competing to showcase their mastery of beverage thermal management as indicators of cultural refinement and technological superiority. The artistic and ceremonial aspects of beverage temperature control elevated the practice beyond mere utility into elaborate court theatre. You observe temperature testing ceremonies, elaborate presentations of cooling equipment, and ritualized serving procedures that transformed beverage temperature maintenance into entertainment and spectacle that showcase both scientific achievement and royal authority. The decline of obsessive beverage temperature control came gradually as changing priorities and practical considerations made the system seem increasingly expensive and unnecessary. You witness the slow simplification of temperature requirements. Though some courts maintained elaborate cooling systems for ceremonial occasions and important state functions where traditional temperature control remained symbolically important. The legacy of royal beverage temperature obsessions appears in surviving engineering drawings, court records of ice procurement, and artistic depictions that reveal the extraordinary attention paid to thermal control of royal drinks. You discover that some innovations developed for royal beverage temperature control influenced broader technological advancement, and contributed to eventual developments in refrigeration and thermal management that continue to benefit modern civilization. As you contemplate the elaborate scientific and logistical systems that surrounded something as simple as drink temperature, you begin to understand how royal culture could transform even the most basic human needs into opportunities for technological innovation, political demonstration, and the relentless pursuit of perfection that pushed medieval civilization to achieve engineering feats that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. You step into a world where the very creatures gracing royal tables were governed by complex calendars that made modern dietary restrictions seem simple by comparison, where consuming rabbit during the wrong lunar phase could be interpreted as heretical defiance of divine order, and where the seasonal availability of different animals for royal consumption followed mystical patterns that combined religious doctrine, astronomical observations, and superstitious beliefs into an intricate system of culinary prohibition and permission. The enormous chart displayed prominently in the royal kitchen resembles a medieval computer program more than a simple menu guide. You observe kitchen masters consulting this elaborate calendar that maps the relationship between celestial movements, religious observances, and the complex rules governing which animals can be consumed during specific periods. The chart is colour-coded with symbols representing different creatures, from common fowl to exotic game, each with detailed notations about their appropriate consumption windows and the spiritual or political implications of eating them at wrong times. The scene before you reveals the staggering complexity of royal meat management. You watch as specialized servants maintain live inventories of dozens of different animal species, each housed in separate facilities designed to preserve their ritual purity and symbolic significance. These aren't simply food storage areas, they're sacred menageries where creatures await their destiny according to cosmic timing and religious requirements that could delay their consumption for months, or accelerate it based on urgent spiritual needs. The mainstream historical fact underlying sacred animal consumption calendars stems from the deep integration of religious doctrine and astronomical observation in medieval life. The Catholic Church's complex fasting requirements, combined with pagan traditions about seasonal animal symbolism and medical theories about the relationship between consumption timing and bodily health, created a system where eating the wrong animal at the wrong time could constitute both religious sin and medical malpractice. The religious foundation of animal consumption timing was extraordinarily detailed and rigorously enforced. You discover that different animals were associated with specific saints, religious holidays, and spiritual qualities that determined their appropriate consumption periods. Lamb could only be consumed during certain Easter season windows, while deer hunting and consumption was restricted to periods that honoured St. Hubert, and fish consumption followed elaborate Lenten calendars that made modern Fridays-only fish rules seem remarkably simple. The astronomical components of animal consumption calendars required court astronomers to maintain detailed calculations about planetary influences on the different creatures. You observe complex theories about how celestial movements affected the spiritual and nutritional qualities of various animals, with Mars ascending considered ideal for consuming aggressive game like boar, while Venus rising favoured gentle creatures like doves and rabbits. These weren't casual preferences, they were scientific principles that demanded precise timing and careful observation. The seasonal restrictions created incredible logistical challenges for royal kitchen management. You watch as kitchen staff navigate periods when multiple animal types are simultaneously prohibited, forcing them to rely on increasingly exotic or expensive alternatives to maintain proper royal nutrition. Some seasons brought feast periods when multiple animals became available simultaneously, requiring massive cooking operations and storage systems to take advantage of brief windows of consumption opportunity. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this system even more fascinating involves the development of animal substitution protocols, elaborate rules for replacing prohibited creatures with spiritually equivalent alternatives when consumption calendars conflicted with political necessity or medical emergency. These substitutions weren't random, they followed complex theological and symbolic logic that maintained spiritual compliance while addressing practical needs through carefully calculated creature exchanges. The international diplomatic implications of animal consumption calendars created unique challenges for state dinners and foreign relations. You witness elaborate negotiations between courts about appropriate animal offerings for visiting dignitaries, with careful consideration given to the consumption calendars of both host and guest kingdoms. Some diplomatic incidents were triggered by misunderstandings about animal timing. While successful diplomatic meals required coordination between multiple religious and astronomical calculation systems, the economic impact of maintaining sacred animal consumption calendars was enormous. You observe the substantial costs associated with maintaining diverse animal populations in various states of readiness, the expensive feed and housing requirements for creatures that might wait months for their appropriate consumption windows, and the specialized knowledge required to manage complex timing systems that affected every aspect of royal food procurement and preparation. The medical theories supporting timed animal consumption became increasingly sophisticated as court physicians developed elaborate relationships between creature consumption timing and human health. You discover detailed charts showing how eating different animals during specific periods could promote various beneficial effects, with spring rabbits prescribed for fertility enhancement while autumn deer consumption was believed to strengthen the blood for winter challenges. Historians still argue whether sacred animal consumption calendars reflected genuine religious and medical beliefs, or served primarily as methods of demonstrating royal sophistication and spiritual devotion. The complexity of these systems certainly showcase the intellectual resources available to royal courts while providing regular opportunities to demonstrate adherence to divine will through elaborate dietary observance. The training required for managing animal consumption calendars involved extensive education in religious doctrine, astronomical calculation, and practical animal husbandry. You watch specialized servants learning to interpret complex calendar system, coordinate timing requirements with kitchen operations, and maintain the detailed records necessary for ensuring compliance with both spiritual and political requirements surrounding creature consumption. The breeding and maintenance implications of consumption calendars influenced royal agricultural practices and animal management systems. You observe elaborate breeding programs designed to ensure appropriate animals would be available during their permitted consumption windows, with careful genetic planning that took into account both practical farming considerations and the symbolic requirements of different creature types for royal dining purposes. The psychological impact of animal consumption timing on royal participants was profound and sometimes restrictive. You watch monarchs developing strong preferences for specific creatures that aligned with their personal spiritual beliefs or political positions, while others became anxious about the complex timing requirements that could make spontaneous dining nearly impossible without extensive consultation and calculation. The architectural requirements for managing diverse animal populations influenced palace design and agricultural facility construction. You notice specialized housing for different creature types, elaborate storage systems for maintaining animals in various states of preparation, and coordination facilities where timing calculations could be performed alongside practical animal management activities. The competitive aspects of animal consumption calendar mastery created interesting dynamics among royal courts. with kingdoms developing increasingly sophisticated timing systems that demonstrated religious devotion and intellectual sophistication. You witness elaborate displays of consumption calendar expertise during international visits, with courts competing to showcase their mastery of creature timing as indicators of spiritual advancement and cultural refinement. The artistic and ceremonial aspects of animal consumption calendars elevated the practice beyond mere dietary management into elaborate demonstrations of cosmic awareness and divine obedience. You observe ceremonies marking transitions between consumption periods, elaborate presentations of newly available creatures, and ritualized selection processes that transformed animal consumption from necessity into spiritual observance and political theatre. The decline of complex animal consumption calendars came gradually as changing religious attitudes and practical considerations made the system seem increasingly burdensome and unnecessarily restrictive. You witness the slow simplification of consumption timing requirements, though elements of these traditions persisted in modified forms that continued to recognize the symbolic importance of appropriate creature consumption while reducing administrative complexity. The legacy of sacred animal consumption calendars appears in surviving agricultural records, religious dietary guidelines, and court documents that reveal the extraordinary attention paid to the spiritual and temporal aspects of creature consumption. You discover that some elements of these traditions influence broader cultural attitudes about seasonal eating, religious dietary observance, and the symbolic relationships between humans and animals that continue to shape modern dietary customs and agricultural practices. As you contemplate the elaborate spiritual and practical systems that surrounded something as fundamental as deciding which animals to eat when, you begin to understand how royal culture could transform even the most basic survival activities into complex demonstrations of religious devotion, cosmic awareness, and the endless human capacity to create meaning and ceremony around the essential biological function that sustain life itself. You enter a dining hall where human beings have been transformed into living furniture, where servants become invisible extensions of tables and chairs, and where the bizarre protocol of invisible servant dining creates an otherworldly atmosphere that challenges every notion of human dignity and social interaction. The scene before you resembles a surreal theatrical performance, where dozens of people work with mechanical precision while being systematically ignored, creating one of the most psychologically complex and morally troubling aspects of royal dining culture. The elaborate dinner service unfolding around you operates with the eerie efficiency of a well-oiled machine, yet every moving part of this machine is human. You watch as servants glide singing between courses, their movements so perfectly choreographed, and their presence so deliberately overlooked that they seem to exist in a parallel dimension separated from the royal reality by invisible barriers of protocol and social conditioning that transform living people into animated objects. The training required to achieve perfect invisibility during royal dining was extraordinarily demanding and psychologically transformative. You observe servants who have spent years learning to move without making sounds, to anticipate needs without being asked, and to perform complex service tasks while maintaining the illusion that these actions are happening through supernatural agency rather than human labour. Their movements are so fluid and solent that dishes appear and disappear as if manipulated by invisible hands. The mainstream historical factors underlying invisible servant protocols stems from medieval beliefs about the sacred nature of royal presence and the need to maintain the illusion of divine service. Kings were considered God's representatives on earth, and acknowledging the human labour required for their comfort would diminish the mystical atmosphere necessary to maintain royal authority and divine connection. Servants weren't just ignored, they were systematically erased from royal consciousness. The psychological conditioning required to transform servants into human furniture involved techniques that would be considered extreme by any modern standard. You discover training programs that lasted for years, during which servants learned to suppress normal human responses, eliminate spontaneous movements, and develop the ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining constant alertness for royal needs. This wasn't simply service training, it was systematic dehumanization disguised as professional education. The physical demands of invisible servant dining were extraordinary and often health-threatening. You watch as servants maintain uncomfortable positions for extended periods, holding serving platters aloft for hours, standing motionless in cramped spaces, and performing repetitive movements that caused permanent physical damage. Some servants developed chronic conditions from the sustained physical stress of maintaining perfect invisibility while providing complex service functions. The communication systems developed for invisible servant coordination were ingenious and complex. You observe elaborate networks of silent signals, hidden communication methods, and coordinated movements that allowed dozens of invisible servants to work together seamlessly without ever acknowledging each other's existence. These communication systems resembled military operations more than household service, requiring precision timing and flawless execution. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this system even more disturbing involves the development of servant camouflage, specialized clothing and accessories designed to make servants blend into architectural backgrounds and furniture. Some courts employed servants dressed as curtains to wallpaper or decorative elements, while others used strategic lighting and positioning to create literal optical illusions that rendered human workers nearly invisible to royal observers. The economic implications of maintaining invisible servant systems were substantial. You discover that achieving perfect invisibility required extensive training, specialized equipment, and often permanent physical modifications that increased the cost of servant employment while creating dependencies that made escape from service nearly impossible. The investment required to create properly invisible servants made them valuable property that courts protected and maintained like expensive equipment. The international diplomatic challenges created by invisible servant protocols occasionally caused confusion and discomfort for foreign visitors unaccustomed to being served by apparently supernatural forces. You witness visiting ambassadors attempting to thank invisible servants, only to be gently corrected by hosts who maintained that no human assistance was being provided, creating awkward diplomatic moments that required careful management and cultural explanation. The medical implications of the invisible servant training concerned some court physicians who recognized the psychological and physical toll of systematic dehumanization. You observe doctors developing specialized treatments for servant-specific ailments, including joint problems from sustained awkward positioning, psychological conditions from enforced silence, and nutritional deficiencies from eating only during brief, hidden break periods that couldn't interfere with royal dining schedules. Historians still argue whether invisible servant systems reflected genuine beliefs about royal divinity or serve primarily as methods of maintaining social control and psychological dominance. The practice certainly created clear distinctions between royal and servant classes, while providing daily demonstrations of absolute power through the ability to render human beings essentially non-existent through sheer force of protocol and social conditioning. The architectural requirements for invisible servant operations influenced palace design and dining room construction. You notice hidden passages that allowed servants to appear and disappear without being observed, concealed storage areas for equipment and supplies, and spatial arrangements that provided numerous hiding places where servants could wait invisibly for service opportunities. Some dining rooms resembled stage sets designed around the requirements of invisible service, Rather than traditional architectural principles, the training hierarchy among invisible servants created complex, internal social structures that operated entirely outside royal awareness. You watch experienced invisible servants teaching newcomers the intricate skills required for perfect service while maintaining absolute silence and invisibility. These training relationships were often the only human connections available to servants who had been systematically isolated from normal social interaction. The psychological impact of invisible servant protocols on both servants and royalty was profound and often destructive. You observe servants developing identity disorders from being systematically ignored, while some royalty became so accustomed to invisible service that they lost the ability to acknowledge human assistance even in informal settings. The system created psychological dependencies that affected everyone involved in ways that extended far beyond dining arrangements. The religious justifications for invisible servant systems connected to broader medieval beliefs about divine order and social hierarchy. You discover theological arguments that positioned invisible service as a form of spiritual devotion, with servants achieving closeness to divine royalty through self-erasure and perfect service. Some court chaplains blessed invisible servant training, transforming dehumanization into religious observance. The competitive aspects of invisible servant mastery created interesting dynamics among royal courts, with kingdoms developing increasingly sophisticated invisibility systems that demonstrated cultural refinement and service excellence. You witness elaborate displays of invisible servant expertise during international visits, with courts competing to showcase the seamless perfection of their human furniture operations as indicators of royal power and household management sophistication. The decline of invisible servant systems came gradually as changing social attitudes and humanitarian concerns made the practice seem increasingly problematic and morally questionable. You observe the slow recognition of servant humanity. Though elements of highly formalized service protocols persisted in modified forms that maintained service excellence, while acknowledging the human dignity of service providers, the artistic and ceremonial aspects of invisible servant operations elevated the practice beyond mere service into elaborate demonstrations of social control and psychological mastery. You watch service operations that resembled performance art, with invisible servants creating seamless dining experiences that showcase the royal ability to command absolute obedience and social erasure through sheer force of protocol and conditioning. The legacy of invisible servant systems appears in surviving training manuals, palace architectural features, and artistic depictions that reveal the extraordinary lengths to which royal courts would go to maintain illusions of divine service and supernatural assistance. You discover that some elements of highly formal service traditions continue in modified forms that recognize professional excellence, while respecting human dignity and social recognition. As you contemplate the elaborate systems of human invisibility that surrounded royal dining, you begin to understand how power structures could transform basic human relationships into complex demonstrations of social control that challenged fundamental concepts of human dignity, while creating service systems that pushed the boundaries of what people could be trained to accept as normal social interaction. You find yourself witnessing one of the most extraordinary transformations of simple sustenance into elaborate spiritual theatre, where royal meals stretch into marathon religious ceremonies that could last longer than modern musical festivals, and where the simple act of eating breakfast might require the coordination of dozens of clergy, hundreds of prayers, and enough religious ritual to exhaust even the most devout participants. The world of royal food blessing marathons reveals how medieval courts managed to transform every meal into a theological event of staggering complexity and duration. The scene before you resembles a cathedral service more than a dining experience. You observe rows of clergy arranged around the royal table like a religious choir, each holding prayer books thick enough to serve as weapons, while elaborate religious artifacts, golden chalices, ornate crosses, and jeweled religious relics compete for space with dining implements on surfaces that blur the line between altar and table. The king sits patiently as wave after wave of blessings wash over his untouched meal, understanding that hours of religious ceremony must precede even the smallest bite of food. The complexity of royal meal blessing protocols required the coordination of multiple religious hierarchies and theological traditions. You watch as bishops, abbots, court chaplains, and visiting religious dignitaries navigate elaborate precedence rules that determine the order of blessing ceremonies, each religious authority contributing specific prayers, rituals, and spiritual interventions that must be completed before royal consumption can safely begin. This isn't simply saying grace, it's conducting full religious services centered around food sanctification, the mainstream historical fact underlying food blessing. Marathon stems from medieval beliefs about the spiritual dangers surrounding royal consumption and the need for extensive divine protection against both physical and supernatural threats. Food was considered a potential gateway for evil influences, poisoning attempts, and spiritual contamination, requiring elaborate religious intervention to ensure that royal meals served divine rather than demonic purposes. The theological framework supporting extensive meal blessings drew from multiple religious traditions and scholarly interpretations. You discover complex theories about the spiritual transformation of food through prayer, the protective power of accumulated blessings, and the belief that royal consumption without proper religious preparation could invite divine punishment, political disaster, or even spiritual damnation that might affect entire kingdoms through their monarch's religious negligence. The specialized training required for conducting royal food blessings created entire educational programs within religious institutions. You observe clergy studying not just traditional theology, but specialized liturgies for food sanctification, learning the proper ceremonies for different types of meals, and mastering the complex timing required to coordinate religious and culinary requirements. These weren't standard religious services. They were highly specialized theatrical productions that combined worship with practical dining logistics. The equipment and materials required for proper food blessing ceremonies represented substantial investments in religious infrastructure. You watch as elaborate portable altars are assembled around dining areas. Specialized religious vessels are filled with holy water for food sanctification, and libraries of prayer books are consulted to ensure proper coverage of all necessary spiritual protections. Some royal dining rooms resembled temporary churches more than eating spaces. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this practice even more extraordinary involves the development of blessing efficiency protocols, attempts to streamline religious ceremonies without compromising spiritual effectiveness. Some courts experimented with simultaneous blessing by multiple clergy, abbreviated prayer cycles for less important meals, and emergency blessing procedures for situations where immediate consumption was required for political or medical reasons, creating religious fast-track systems that balance spiritual necessity with practical demands. The international diplomatic implications of food blessing marathons created unique challenges for foreign relations and state dinners. You witness elaborate negotiations between courts about appropriate religious protocols for visiting dignitaries of different faiths, with some diplomatic incidents triggered by disagreements about blessing requirements. Muslim ambassadors, Jewish merchants, and Orthodox Christian delegates all required specialized religious accommodations that could extend meal ceremonies into day-long events. The medical theories supporting extensive food blessing connected to broader medieval beliefs about the relationship between spiritual and physical health. You observe court physicians arguing that inadequately blessed food could cause everything from indigestion to political instability, while properly sanctified meals were believed to provide protection against disease, poison, and supernatural attack. The medical and religious justifications for blessing marathons reinforced each other in ways that made the practice seem both spiritually essential and medically necessary. The economic impact of maintaining elaborate food blessing systems was enormous. You discover that some royal courts spent more on religious ceremonies surrounding meals than on the actual food being consumed, employing dozens of clergy, maintaining extensive religious libraries, and purchasing specialized equipment that served no purpose beyond food sanctification. The cost of blessing marathons sometimes exceeded military budgets, making spiritually protected dining one of the most expensive aspects of royal lifestyle. Historians still argue whether food blessing marathons reflected genuine religious conviction or served primarily as demonstrations of royal piety and divine connection. The elaborate nature of these ceremonies certainly showcased the spiritual resources available to royal courts while providing regular opportunities to demonstrate religious devotion and the lengths to which monarchs would go to ensure divine favour and protection. The psychological impact of marathon blessing sessions on both royalty and participants was profound and sometimes problematic. You watch monarchs developing dependencies on extensive religious protection that made spontaneous eating nearly impossible, while clergy experienced physical and mental exhaustion from conducting lengthy ceremonies multiple times daily. Some participants developed religious anxiety about inadequately blessed food that extended far beyond normal spiritual concern. The architectural requirements for proper food blessing influence palace design and dining room construction. You notice specially designed religious spaces connected to dining areas, storage facilities for ceremonial equipment, and acoustic arrangements that accommodated lengthy religious services without disrupting kitchen operations. Some royal dining complexes resembled religious institutions more than residential palaces, with chapel-like features integrated into every eating space. The competitive aspects of food blessing elaborate created interesting dynamics among royal courts, with kingdoms developing increasingly sophisticated religious ceremonies that demonstrated spiritual devotion and theological sophistication. You witness elaborate displays of blessing marathon expertise during international visits, with courts competing to showcase their religious dedication through increasingly lengthy and complex food sanctification ceremonies. The seasonal and ceremonial variations in blessing requirements reflected the religious calendar and special observances. You discover that different times of year demanded different blessing protocols, with Christmas meals requiring extended ceremonies that could last entire days, while Lent brought simplified but more frequent blessing requirements. Some religious holidays demanded blessing marathons so extensive they required advanced planning and specialized religious consultation. The artistic and ceremonial aspects of food blessing marathons elevated the practice beyond mere religious observance into elaborate demonstrations of divine connection and spiritual authority. You observe blessing ceremonies that resembled theatrical productions with coordinated musical accompaniment, elaborate costume changes for clergy, and ritualized food presentations that transformed dining preparation into religious spectacle and political theatre. The decline of elaborate food blessing marathons came gradually as changing religious attitudes and practical considerations made the ceremonies seem increasingly time-consuming and unnecessarily complex. You witness the slow simplification of blessing requirements, though elements of formal food sanctification persisted in modified forms that maintained spiritual protection. while reducing the temporal demands of extensive religious ceremony. The legacy of royal food blessing marathons appears in surviving religious texts, ceremonial descriptions, and artistic depictions that reveal the extraordinary integration of spiritual and culinary practices in medieval court life. You discover that some innovations in religious ceremony developed for food blessing influenced broader liturgical practices and contributed to developments in religious theatre and ceremonial coordination that extended far beyond dining applications. As you contemplate the elaborate religious theatre that surrounded something as basic as eating food, you begin to understand how royal culture could transform even the most fundamental biological necessities into opportunities for spiritual demonstration, divine connection, and religious spectacle that push the boundaries of ceremonial practice while creating dining experiences that challenged both physical endurance and spiritual devotion in ways that modern minds can barely comprehend. You enter the most politically charged moment of any royal meal, the final bite that carries more weight than crown jewels, more significance than treaty, and more potential for chaos than entire military campaigns. The scene before you reveals how the last morsel of food on the royal plate has been transformed into a complex system of succession laws, inheritance rights, and political communications that could determine the fate of kingdoms through something as simple as who gets to consume the final crumb of bread or the last drop of wine remaining in the royal goblet. The tension in the dining hall is palpable, as a courtiers watch with the intensity of battlefield commanders, their eyes fixed not on military maps, but on the dwindling portions remaining on the royal table. You observe the careful calculations taking place as nobles assess the political implications of each remaining bite, understanding that the final morsel's destination will send messages about succession planning, royal favour, and power distribution that could reshape the entire kingdom's future through the medium of leftover food. The protocols governing the final bite succession were so complex they required dedicated court positions and elaborate legal frameworks. You watch the Royal Final Bite Coordinator, a position that combined legal expertise, political acumen, and intimate knowledge of royal dining habits. As they monitor the meal's progress and prepare for the climactic moment when the last piece of food must be allocated according to laws more intricate than most constitutional documents. The mainstream historical fact underlying final bite succession laws stems from medieval beliefs about the transfer of royal essence and authority through consumption. The last food touched by royal lips was considered to carry the most concentrated royal power, making its disposition a matter of genuine political and spiritual significance that could affect everything from military command structure to religious authority and diplomatic relationships with foreign powers. The legal framework supporting final bite inheritance was extraordinarily detailed and rigorously enforced. You discover elaborate precedent systems that determined succession rights based on bloodline proximity, current political favour, military service, religious devotion, and complex calculations that weighed multiple factors to identify the rightful recipient of each type of final morsel. These weren't casual decisions, they were legal determinations that required consultation with court lawyers and historical precedent researchers. The categories of final bite succession created fascinating hierarchies of royal remnants. You observe different rules governing the final bite of bread versus the last sip of wine, with meat remnants following entirely different succession protocols from fruit or vegetable remains. Each type of food carried its own symbolic significance and inheritance implications, creating a complex legal matrix that governed the distribution of royal meal conclusions. The international diplomatic implications of final bite succession created unique opportunities and challenges for foreign relations. You witness visiting ambassadors studying final bite protocols before attending state dinners, understanding that being offered the final morsel from a royal meal represented either exceptional honour or subtle political messaging that required careful interpretation. Some diplomatic relationships were strengthened or damaged based on final bite allocation decisions during crucial negotiations. The training required for managing final bite succession involved extensive education in law, politics, and court protocol. You watch specialized courtiers learning to read royal eating patterns, predict when final bites would occur, and coordinate the complex legal and ceremonial requirements that surrounded these politically charged moments. These skills often determined career advancement and required years of study and practice to master. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this system even more fascinating involves the development of final bite insurance policies, complex arrangements where multiple potential recipients would be prepared for different scenarios, with backup succession plans and contingency protocols designed to handle situations where the expected final bite recipient was unavailable, politically inappropriate, or had fallen from royal favour since the meal began. The religious dimensions of final bite succession connected to broader medieval beliefs about divine authority and spiritual transmission. You discover theological theories about how the final consumption of royal meals carried special spiritual significance, with some clergy arguing that the last bite represented the completion of divine communion and should be allocated according to religious rather than political considerations, creating tension between secular and spiritual authorities over final morsel rights. The economic implications of final bite succession were substantial, as the right to receive royal meal conclusions often carried monetary value that could be traded, inherited, or used as collateral for loans. You observe complex financial arrangements surrounding final bite rights, with some courtiers building their entire economic strategies around positioning themselves favourably for valuable final morsel allocations that could provide substantial income or political leverage. The psychological impact of final bite politics on court participants was profound and sometimes destructive. You watch courtiers developing obsessive relationships with final bite positioning, some becoming so focused on meal conclusion politics that they barely participated in normal dining conversation. Others experienced severe anxiety about potential final bite rejection, understanding that being passed over could signal catastrophic falls from royal favour. Historians still argue whether final bite succession laws reflected genuine beliefs about royal power transmission, or served primarily as methods of maintaining social control and political hierarchy through the distribution of symbolic rewards. The complexity of these systems certainly provided daily opportunities for monarchs to demonstrate favour, while creating dependencies that bound courtiers to royal presence through the promise of meaningful final morsel allocation. The seasonal and ceremonial variations in final bite succession reflected different types of meals and their political significance. You discover that final bites from Christmas feasts carried different succession implications than those from ordinary dinners, while final morsels from diplomatic banquets followed entirely different protocols from private family meals. Some occasions demanded specific final bite recipients based on ceremonial requirements rather than normal succession laws. The architectural requirements for proper final bite ceremonies influenced dining room design and seating arrangements. You notice specially designed spaces where final bite recipients could receive their portions with appropriate ceremony, storage facilities for final bite preparation equipment, and spatial arrangements that allowed all participants to witness the political significance of final morsel allocation while maintaining proper protocol and ceremonial dignity. The competitive aspects of final bite succession created intense dynamics among courtiers, with complex strategies developed for positioning oneself favourably for final morsel allocation. You witness elaborate social manoeuvring, strategic alliance building, and political calculations that revolved around final bite possibilities, creating court cultures where meal conclusions became more important than the primary dining experience. The decline of elaborate final bite succession laws came gradually as changing political structures and practical considerations made the system seem increasingly complex and politically problematic. You observe the slow simplification of final morsel protocols, though elements of these traditions persisted in modified forms that continue to recognize the symbolic importance of meal conclusions, while reducing the legal and political complications surrounding final bite allocation. The artistic and ceremonial aspects of final bite succession elevated the practice beyond mere food distribution into elaborate demonstrations of royal authority and political communication. You watch final bite ceremonies that resembled coronation rituals, with formal presentations, ceremonial equipment, and ritualized consumption that transformed meal conclusions into political theatre and symbolic communication that could influence kingdom management and international relations. The legacy of final bite succession laws appears in surviving legal documents, court records, and ceremonial descriptions that reveal the extraordinary political significance attached to the simplest aspects of royal dining. You discover that some principles developed for final bite succession influenced broader concepts of inheritance law, symbolic authority transfer, and political communications that continue to shape modern understanding of ceremonial power and symbolic governance. As you witness the final moments of this extraordinary journey through royal dining culture, watching as the last morsel disappears in a ceremony laden with political meaning and historical significance, you begin to understand how human beings could transform literally any aspect of daily life into complex systems of meaning, power, and social organization that elevated basic survival activities into elaborate cultural performances that shape civilizations and created traditions whose echoes continue to influence how we think about food, power, and the endless human capacity to find profound meaning in the simplest acts of staying alive. The elaborate protocols, bizarre restrictions, and complex ceremonies you've witnessed throughout this exploration of royal dining culture reveal a world where eating became art, survival became theatre, and every meal represented a carefully choreographed performance of power, spirituality, and social control that transformed royal tables into stages where the fundamental dramas of human civilization played out through the simple acts of consuming food and maintaining life. Your journey through these forgotten dining halls and abandoned protocols now draws to its natural conclusion, leaving you with a deeper appreciation for the extraordinary lengths to which human beings will go to create meaning, demonstrate authority, and transform even the most basic biological necessities into opportunities for cultural expression and social organization that challenge our understanding of what it means to be human in a world where even eating can become a profound statement about power, divine connection, and the endless complexity of social existence. As you settle deeper into your comfortable position, feeling the weight of centuries of bizarre royal dining traditions slowly dissolving into the peaceful darkness around you, let these strange tales of poisoned meals and invisible servants, of musical mastication and astronomical timing, gently carry you toward the restful sleep that awaits. The elaborate ceremonies and complex protocols that once governed royal tables have faded into history, leaving only whispered memories of a time when eating was never simple, when every bite carried meaning, and when dinner could determine the fate of kingdoms through the most unlikely combinations of food, power, and human imagination. Rest now, knowing that your own simple meals are blessedly free from the burden of cosmic timing, colour-coded symbolism, and succession laws, and let the gentle absurdity of these forgotten dining customs lull you into dreams where food is just food, where eating is just eating, and where the only protocol that matters is the quiet satisfaction of a peaceful night's sleep. Sweet dreams await you in a world much simpler than the royal dining halls we've explored together, where rest comes without ceremony, and sleep requires no elaborate preparation beyond the soft comfort of your bed and the gentle fade of consciousness into the welcoming darkness of a well-earned night's rest.